Ladies and gentlemen, we're privileged today to have the opportunity to interview Dr. George Schreiner for the ISN Video Legacy Project. The interviewers will be Dr. Agnes Fogo and myself, Dr. Kim Soles. I think, George, that we'll start at the beginning, if you'd like to tell us about your birth and early childhood, and we'll take it from there, I guess.
Well, I was born in Buffalo, New York on April 26th, 1922. And went to school in a little school that was part of a sort of generalized educational campus that consisted of basically three institutions. A girls' academy, Mount St. Joseph's Academy, private parochial school, St. Vincent's Fall School, and the college, Canisius College, which was a Jesuit college. And my house was directly across the street from the entrance to the college, about 30 feet away from the front lawn of the college. Now occupied by a library, and if you sit in the corner carousel of the library, you can look right into the window of the living room of our old house, which is still there.
So, if we skip ahead then, how did you become interested?
Can you ask that again? Can you go ahead and ask that again? So if we skip ahead from there.
So if we skip ahead from there then, how did you become interested in what happened next then?
I was in high school. Well, I went to Canisius Prep, which was a Jesuit high school, and I got into debating and oratory and a little baseball and a little basketball. The only letter I won was in basketball. And the rest of the time I was traveling with a debating team, which had a very difficult schedule, and we debated similar schools in New York and New Jersey and Philadelphia and Boston. And I went all through prep school, and my team never lost an interscholastic debate, so we had a great record, and I did a great amount of public speaking. It was estimated that I talked before more than 350,000 people before I was 18. And this included all kinds of things, including 40,000 people at a New York State racetrack under the aegis of George Abbott, who was the mayor of Salamanca and the father of George Abbott, the great Broadway producer. And so as a valedictorian of the class, I was offered the president's scholarship at Canisius College. And although I also had some offers from other schools, I liked it so much there. I liked the fact that we had a place in the country in the summertime, a farm that we enjoyed. So I didn't see any great reason for going out of town, because I had all the things that you would want to have in college right handy to my house without any transportation problems. So I just stayed there and enjoyed myself in college.
So once you were there, you majored first in philosophy?
Yes.
How did you graduate?
Well, I started taking Latin and Greek and history, and heading toward a philosophy major, and thinking that I might be interested in going into law. And as I did more and more talking, I realized that there were two parts to oratory. One was technique and voice and those things, and the other was content. And that I saw that, in a way, once I felt very comfortable about the technique, I began to get worried about the content. And so I thought that I would like to have something more concrete, and got interested in science, and decided that medicine would be a very interesting road to travel. And then I took a full major in pre-medical subjects, comparative anatomy and chemistry and physics and so forth, and enjoyed the biology particularly very much.
So how did you choose where to go to medical school?
Yes, I was, again, I was having, even though it was wartime, I was having a great deal of fun in college. And I was very active in all forms of extracurricular activities. In fact, my father and I built the first arena stage in Western New York for a play that our drama club put on, and we had an excellent actor as a mentor, a man named Porter White, whose father was a Shakespearean actor and whose uncle was a playwright. In fact, the first playwright to have 3 plays running simultaneously on Broadway until Mike Nichols did it just a few years ago. And so he was very interested in experimental theater and wanted to build an arena theater. And they had no theater at the college, but they did have a classroom that had steps going up, wooden steps with the seats on the wooden steps. So he went to the president and said, could we make an arena theater out of this? So I went to my father, who was a pretty good carpenter and very handy with wood, and we took a chainsaw, we sawed the whole grandstand of the classroom into pieces of pie, put them on rollers and rolled them around, leaving an avenue out, and put on the first arena play, which was about a man who was going to his execution in an electric chair. And I enjoyed the acting part very, very much, because as I was leaving the stage, it wasn't the stage, just the arena in front of the audience, this woman threw herself on me and said, don't take him, don't let him take you. So I thought that was a convincing demonstration of some kind of communication possibilities. And then we had 24 hours that night after the play to put the pieces of the pie back together again, and have the lecture hall as was, in order to appease the president by the following Monday morning. So that was our venture into theater building.
Quite a story. So,
and then I continued on taking the science subjects, so that by the time I graduated, I had a full complement of hours for a philosophy major, and a full complement in pre-medical biology, the sciences that were required. I was accepted, actually, into medical school after my junior year by the University of Buffalo Medical School, but I was having so much fun that I didn't want to. I wanted to graduate and get my college degree, and also there were additional subjects that I really wanted to have. So I passed it by, and then the draft board started to give me great grief, because it was everybody was seeking to get into medical school to avoid the draft, and they couldn't understand why I would turn an acceptance down. And but I finally persuaded them to do so, and I was accepted at several medical schools, and took Georgetown because I thought it would be very interesting, particularly in wartime. And it was. We had 3 or 4 major professors from Harvard who were here in the military during the war and taught. So we had a really marvelous faculty, plus many refugees, of course, from Europe came here because it was the capital. I took a course in the psychology of prejudice, for example, a graduate course from one of Freud's leading assistants, and we really had some very marvelous teaching at that time.
So when did you first sense that renal medicine was where your interest would lie, or how did that come about?
Well, it really wasn't specific, although I enjoyed the kidney in physiology, and I did an experiment. We had a seminar for honor students in physiology, and I took that program, and the experiment that I remember we did was to make a trephine hole in the skull and then apply pressure, and you could produce reflex pulmonary edema by raising the intracerebral pressure of a dog. And we graded the response, the amount of pulmonary edema produced and so forth, and the amount of leakage by in relationship to the pressure rises in the cerebral, and I enjoyed that experiment very much. So I liked physiology particularly, but I didn't know enough about the kidney to make any sort of a decision at that time until I got into my internship. And I interned at the Boston City Hospital, and at that time, that was actually fairly unusual for Georgetown. Georgetown had an excellent university hospital, but they also had a little bit of an atmosphere of provincialism, so they regularly, maybe took 12 of the top 14 or 15 students in the class and kept them as their own house staff at the university hospital, which I did not want to do, so I went to Boston City Hospital and became an officer in the House Officers Association, which had previously had a riot to try to get paid, and they found out the head of the House Staff Association was a communist, so Mayor Curley wouldn't have anything to do with him, and the House staff was getting treated sort of roughly, so we turned to a more diplomatic approach to Mayor Curley. But while I was there, I did a couple of interesting things. I came out of the House Officers Building one morning, and we had a place called the East Boston Relief Station, which is on the other side of Sumner Tunnel. And this was to help out the people who lived in East Boston in case there was tunnel failure. There would be some medicine there for emergency work. So they maintained this small hospital, really, in East Boston just for that purpose. So we had to do a rotation out through there. It was quite a long ways, and it took a lot of time by public transportation. So when I walked out one morning from the House Officers Building, there was a chauffeur-driven Cadillac parked there. And I talked to the driver, and we got chatting and got friendly, and he said, what are you doing? And I said, well, I'm going out to East Boston Relief Station. He said, well, I don't have anything to do, I'll drive you. So he took me out with his chauffeur's uniform and the Cadillac out to East Boston Relief Station. And we got very friendly, and he started picking me up and taking me twice a day. And one day, Dr. Maneri, who was the hospital superintendent, came out looking for his car. And he said, where is my car? And someone said, an intern has it. He said, what's that guy's name? I'm in my office in 30 minutes. So I went in, and he says, I'll give you 2 seconds to tell me why you shouldn't be fired. And I said, because you need good doctors. And he said, elevator operators are hard to get. Doctors are diabetes. And so we kidded around and actually became good friends. But I promised not to steal his car again.
Very good. Okay, why don't we cut there?
Dr. Schreiner, could you tell us about your experiences that led to your interest in renal medicine during your internship training?
Yes, indeed. Because of the vagaries of the 999 system during the war, that is, we went through summers and we had 36 months of school, but it was done in 3 calendar years without any vacations. So I started at Boston City on April the 1st, but there was a house staff still there from the previous year because they were switching over to July. So in effect, they had 2 house staffs. So we became residents before we were interns. And I was a resident on what is called the South Department, which is disease division, but thinking it would be a very easy time. And in fact, I had in mind to try to associate with Thorndike and get some research done. And on the 2nd or 3rd day that I was there, somebody came in with a sore throat, and it turned out to be the beginning of the great Boston diphtheria epidemic. And we had something like 8 patients in the South Department the day I started. By the end of the month, we had over 450 patients, and my partner and I set the all-time Boston City record by admitting 63 patients. This means history, physical, blood work, doing it all the slides ourselves, the urinalyses and everything, and cultures on 63 patients within one 24-hour period, which I don't think has ever been
And it won't ever be beaten.
But so we worked to exhaustion through the great Boston diphtheria epidemic, and then after being a resident, I went back to being an intern again on the regular medical wards. Meanwhile, we had started this Boston City Hospital Association. Boston City Hospital treated its house staff rather poorly. There were no salaries. The only thing we got was living and uniforms, and you were allowed to bring your date or your wife to dinner on Sunday. That was the whole return you got for your work. So everybody was very anxious to start getting paid. So another chap named Herman and myself undertook to try to endear the House Officers Association to the hospital. So we wrote the first House Officers Manual together, and that's also still being used at the Boston City Hospital. I think the last time I saw it was still a similar cover. They changed it, of course, from time to time. And then we started this House Officers Association, and I found out that all of the GIs coming back were entitled to a payment from the government, which was supposed to be for educational institutions. In other words, if you went and took a graduate course and you were on the GI Bill of Rights, the institution that you went to received something like $500, which was supposed to pay the overhead of your studies and the supplies and all that sort of thing. And I just asked myself, where was all this money going to in a hospital which already had all those things? And no one seemed to know. So anyway, I did a little detective work, tracked it down, and found out that it was all being banked in some hospital account. And I got the only woman trustee at the Boston City Hospital on my side, and we managed to get the mayor to approve taking this by now rather large amount of money, because we had hundreds of veterans coming back to the Boston City Hospital. And with it, we established the Boston City Hospital House Officer Lecture Series with dinners and beautiful evenings and so forth, and had Dr. Castle appointed as a mentor to the House officers. And then we had these one absolute outstanding scientists from all over the world, literally every other week. Sam Levine was the first one, and one of the speakers was Homer Smith. And so we brought him, Dr. Castle had a reception for him after the lecture in his home and invited me. And that's where I met him and spent the evening talking with him and learning about him and so forth. And so I got interested and read a few of his things. And then when I finished my internship, I ate lunch about once or twice a week with Dr. Castle. He became a very close friend and mentor. Also, Max Finland, the infectious disease man, became a very good friend. And we later, all three of us, served on the National Drug Research Board at in Washington. And I told him what I wanted to do. There were no fellowships under the way we understand the word today, so you had to sort of apprentice yourself as a research assistant. And he suggested 3 people that I should go and interview, and he wrote letters for. And one was at the Cleveland Clinic, and one in California, and the other was Homer Smith. So I couldn't get to California, but I got to the Cleveland Clinic, and then I went to Homer Smith's place where I set up an interview. And when I got there for the interview, he started asking me very detailed questions and went into philosophy and theology and my family relationships and what I did for hobbies and things I had written and all sorts of things. And it lasted over 2.5 hours, almost 3 hours. I couldn't understand this because he had over 30 research assistants in the department, some of them outstanding people, like Irving Schwartz and Marvin Levitt and Mario Gaudino and people like that. And I'm sure that he couldn't possibly have spent that much time with all of these research assistants. So I was really sort of baffled by the whole experience. And then suddenly he stood up, put his hand across the desk and said, "You have the job." And he said, "Don't come to New York, go directly to the Mount Desert Island Biology Laboratory in Maine, Salisbury Cove, and then come back down here in the fall, and we'll try to work out and see how you could get a room." And it turned out, of course, that Larry Wesson, who was also from the Boston City Hospital and who also had been recommended by Bill Castle, had an apartment and wanted to share it, so he and I became roommates. And then the following fall, but that summer I worked at the Mount Desert and worked on marine animals and did a lot of work on the daddy sculpin, which becomes progressively aglomerular as it gets older. And we were injecting inulin to see what happened to the inulin when the glomeruli disappeared. And of course, it continued to circulate through the extracellular fluid. So it also became a way of measuring extracellular fluid by dilution technique. If you could manage to hit a blood vessel in a daddy sculpin twice, which we sometimes did. And we did some work helping along with physiology of seals. And I remember also catching flounder for John Taggart, who was using the tubule of the flounder to concentrate PAH and measure TMs and what affected transport of PAH in the flounder tubule. So it was a very fruitful summer, and I got back to New York and went in to see the secretary, and she assigned me to a laboratory. And most of the people there, and as I say, there were over 30 research assistants besides all the faculty, so the department was extremely crowded and sometimes had 4 or 5 people working in a single small room. And I was assigned this lovely laboratory, which was right opposite Dr. Smith's office door in the corridor. And again, I couldn't quite understand what was happening. And I sat down at the desk, opened it up, and there was a slide rule inside. And in the corner was scratched RFP, Robert F. Pitts. And so, of course, Dr. Pitts, who was a very famous renal physiologist, actually originally a neurophysiologist who was nationally famous, and came to spend 1 year with Smith to learn the techniques because he wanted to study the choroid plexus as a capillary bed like the glomerulus. And he got so fascinated with Smith that he stayed and became one of the great renal physiologists in salt water, and indeed had just left for Cornell to become the chairman of the Department of Physiology. So I was given Bob Pitt's laboratory, which really sort of bowled me over because I couldn't understand why. So I went ahead and started my experimental program and did the assignments. He assigned me to take apart the inulin method and take apart the creatinine method and see if I could improve it. And I was doing a dog one day, and the secretary came in and said, "Why aren't you downstairs?" And I said, "Well, why should I be downstairs?" And she said, "Well, Dr. Smith is giving his famous annual lecture on how to teach." And I said, "Well, I didn't see why I had to attend that, and I wanted to get these experiments done." And she says, "It's mandatory." And I said, "Well, why is it mandatory?" And she says, "All the faculty has to go and listen to this lecture on how to teach." And I said, "What does that have to do with me? I'm a research assistant." She said, "Oh, no, you're on the faculty." So this was now almost 4 months later, and that's how I found out that when he said, "You have the job," with his handshake, he didn't mean that I had the job as a research assistant, but that I had a faculty appointment. And of course, I began to sweat bullets and realized that I had to stay up all night in order to stay a few hours ahead of the class in my reading, because I really hadn't had that much background in the subject. But we managed it all right, and Larry Wesson and I became partners running the student laboratory, which is an interesting nephrology story. We decided that we would do actual techniques on the students, not only to teach them the methods, but also to get some normal data. So we decided to do filtration rates and blood flows, and also studies on antidiuretic hormones. So we divided the class into groups, those who drank water and didn't take antidiuretic hormone, those who drank water and did take antidiuretic hormone, and those who took small amounts of water, and those who took large amounts of water, and so forth, and did all the variables into groups. And it just happened that one afternoon, the last group to take the water and the antidiuretic hormone were a group of boys who lived in Greenpoint, Brooklyn, students. That's far out on the Brooklyn subway line. And So the biologic half-life of antidiuretic hormone is about 25, 30 minutes. So they left their laboratory at 5, jumped onto the subway in the rush hour, and when they got out to near Greenpoint, the Greenpoint as they call it, the antidiuretic hormone had run out, and they had these huge water loads of 2 and 3 liters, and of course they had to get out of the subway car. Every time the subway opened, in flowed about 1,000 people crushing in and pushing them back into the car, so they couldn't get out and go to the bathroom. And they reported Larry and myself for unnecessary cruelty to students to the dean's office, and we had to go in and explain that it was not intended to be cruelty to students. But they'll never forget what antidiuretic hormone did.
If they had known their physiology better on the front end, they might not have gotten into that predicament. Tell me about the evolution from this time in Dr. Smith's lab to your subsequent faculty position back at Georgetown. Well,
I stayed with Smith for 3 years, and of course I was interested in clinical nephrology, and so I spoke to Chasis and Goldring, who worked the unit for human research. Clinical research was in Bellevue Hospital, but it was supported entirely by Homer Smith. It was really his unit, but of course he was not an MD, so Goldring and Chasis were nominally in charge, and this was the unit where many wonderful things happened. For example, it's little known that André Cournant, who won the Nobel Prize, came over to America from France. He had done one of the first catheterizations of the central circulation with using the Forceman catheter, and he had this concept of a whole series of experiments he wanted to do to study pulmonary function in relationship to blood flow through the lungs and so forth, all the things for which he won the Nobel Prize. And the people at Columbia Presbyterian, when they heard he was going to put a tube in the heart, became very frightened and said he couldn't do it on their service. And so Homer actually invited Cournant, who had a Columbia appointment, to do his experiments in the NYU unit, and that's where he did all the work that won him the Nobel Prize, which was very interesting. In fact, Homer helped him write the speech that was given before the New York Academy of Medicine that helped get him the prize, and also his acceptance speech. He helped Cournant write, because Cournant's command of English wasn't very great, but they were both really excellent speeches and reflected, of course, Homer's unusual literary ability. So it was a very, very active place. We had 5 or 6 Nobel Prize winners within 300 feet. We had a very, very active group of people, almost all of whom, I think 12 or 13 chairmen of physiology departments came out of that lab within a couple of years. And in places like the University of Virginia, with Parker Anslow, and many, many schools came there to recruit chairman of medicine. And so it was an extremely exciting period, really, the golden age of the Smith years at NYU. And I wanted to get this clinical background, so Goldring and Chasis made a clinical fellowship. So by day I was a physiologist, and by night I was a clinical person, and I worked the clinics in peripheral vascular disease and a postgraduate hospital, and also made rounds every day on Goldring and Chasis's patients, the problem cases, and present the problem cases to them on renal rounds, and did experiments on hypertension with them and so forth. So I had a full clinical program as well as the school program. And it was interesting. Of course, there were many brilliant people around there, but Homer wanted to mix basic science with clinical investigation as much as he could, so he started a seminar series in which a junior faculty member in physiology would be paired with a senior person in medicine. My first assignment was Ludwig Eichner and who later became chairman of medicine and was one of those people who wrote those series of articles when you went back through medical school. You remember, took medical school all over again to see what the experience was like, write about it. And Sal Sherry, who was one of the people that worked with streptokinase for years and became chairman of medicine at Temple University. So we would present cases and have discussions before a senior group. And when I joined Sherry, the first group that I came there, a young man stood up and said, asked me a very, very convoluted, complicated question. And I said, "What is your name, young man?" And he said, "Eugene Brownwall." Now became Hersey professor at Harvard, and now head of the Partners Health Plan, I guess, in Boston.
You met Albert Einstein also, didn't you, one day?
Yes, yes. I was in the same lab doing a dog again, and knock on the door, and I opened the door, and Albert Einstein was standing there with his shock of white hair, and I sort of clicked my heels and came to attention since I had never personally seen him. I was familiar with his pictures, of course. He was, he couldn't be mistaken for anybody else. So I said, "What can I do for you, Dr. Einstein?" He said, "Do you know a fellow named Domingo Gomez?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Can you take me to him?" And well, Gomez was a Cuban who had headed cardiovascular research in Havana and was kicked out by Castro and became a refugee, and Homer gave him a laboratory, and he built a complete model of the human circulation with all the pressures and resistances and everything, right? He also had the first oscilloscope that I ever saw in my life that he'd gotten off a military airplane and adapted as a monitor. Of course, we're familiar with those things now, but there were no such thing as screens for measuring curves and for plotting curves in those days. And so as we were walking back, I said to Dr. Einstein, "Do you mind asking a personal question? Why are you looking for Domingo Gomez?" Who was, very few people in the department even knew him. I used to eat lunch with him because he was a very interesting man. And so Einstein looked at me, he says, "I'm having trouble with an equation," and I thought, I come down here for some help. And I said, "From Domingo Gomez?" And he said, "Yes." He says, "Don't you know he's one of the 5 best mathematicians in the world?" So that's how I met Einstein.
Let's pause there a second while you work on the tape. Yes.
I'm sorry, I got the wrong plug over here.
Yeah, it's not so important to get me with this, and this was just wonderful,
Yeah.
wonderful rock and turns. Are you okay with what you?
How's it look, though, Chases? And the war was the Korean War.
We're not taping right now. I just wondered
yeah.
how.
No, I was.
Yeah.
I didn't know whether you
Oh, I'm
wanted to
sorry.
or not.
She wasn't ringing. It's great that you're.
I'm trying to
you're
get
taking
out
it.
of your way. I actually can click this on and off and not be near her if that's helpful to you.
Oh, no, it wasn't that. I thought it was
I thought I was getting my arm. in there.
Yeah, I got your arm, but I just wanted to, before the next question, I wanted to take the fridge off. I pulled the wrong, the wrong
okay.
plug out before, so. I mean, this is, because we're only using bits and pieces of this for reaction shots, so.
Yes, I don't think that my
Am I in the way, Linda?
my visage is important
No.
at all.
No.
And we certainly haven't worked on my slouching or eyes or squinting or anything like that. I
No,
don't
but I'll
think-
pull your coat down if you want
Great,
to.
thank you. No, it doesn't look better now. Like that. So I will just lead in with the same type of question.
Want me to roll?
Yeah. Mhm.
And by the way, I figured out what was going on with this. This was set at long speed.
Oh,
So it was set at super long speed. So the bulk of it is actually good.
okay,
So
good.
we're running now?
You roll.
Great. So Dr. Schreiner, with all of these hours in the day, you must have more than most people. You managed to do a first-rate research fellowship and clinical fellowship in a remarkably short span.
Yes, it was very remarkable in the time period, but everything was so convenient there, and we lived in the Lower East Side, very close to Bellevue Hospital, so that my travel time was minimized really, and I had many interesting experiences because our pay, of course, was very, very low, and I by this time then had 2 children. And so I had to think about where I was going to go in clinical medicine. And things were beginning to warm up in the world. I had a very close friend. In fact, he was a high school pal of mine who went on to become an ophthalmologist. And he was doing a residency at New York Eye and Ear. So one of the things I did in my clinical fellowship was to work in the Goldring's Hypertension and Nephritis Clinic, and I started doing retinal photography to study the blood vessels, and I found it very difficult. So I got this fellow's name was John Luer. He was very anxious to have research experience, and so we started a study on diabetic retinopathy and doing some of the first retinal photographs of the vascular lesions with drawings and photography. And he came up to help me once a week at the clinic, and then one night he said, I found a wonderful deal. And I said, what's that? He said, all I have to do is some physical examinations for the Navy Reserve, and I get paid this money, and it's very, very easy, and I'm learning stuff and enjoying it. And he said, you ought to do something like that. And I said, well, aren't you concerned, because the world is looking a little rocky, And he said, oh no. So I think he only was there something like 3 weeks, and he disappeared. The next thing I knew was I got a letter from him from Korea, and he was in the First Marine Corps, and that was the first unit activated out of the Brooklyn Navy Yard, and sent him immediately to North Korea. And he had a terrible time in that first winter, which was, people were freezing and having frostbite and losing limbs and everything. And he was such a wonderful person, very tough fellow. But so he sent me letters, and I realized that I had to move on in my clinical training in order to qualify for my boards and so forth. And so I got a residency at the Veterans Hospital in Washington that January. And then met Colonel Stone and talked to him about coming into the Army. Although I was not subject to the draft, because I had been in the Navy and I had an honorable discharge from my B-12 unit, in which I'd been as a medical student. I still hadn't done any real active duty except as a midshipman. So I didn't know, it wasn't really clear whether that constituted a payback for the draft or not. Nobody was really quite sure, because it was a unique situation that our unit was discharged just at the one moment. It was the only time that happened during the war. They had no place to send us, so they discharged us. So I talked to him, and he said that sooner or later, with Korea heating up the way it was, and the war started already very viciously, that he agreed with me that it wouldn't be a bad idea, and then he said he would put in a request for me, because he was anxious to build the staff at Walter Reed Army Research Institute. So I did that and volunteered for the Army, and then I got a captain's commission, and I wrote a couple of papers at the Veterans Hospital and had a chance to work with Ed Fries. In fact, we did the first studies on afterload, which were published in the JCI and weren't adopted by the cardiologists for 19 years before they discovered afterload. We published the first paper 19 years before any cardiologist realized the importance of lowering the blood pressure in patients who had myocardial infarctions. We were doing cardiac outputs by a direct indicator dilution technique, and then getting sliced samples of blood from the femoral artery, and in order to make the dye curve go for measuring cardiac output. So I would do the femoral punctures and set up the measurements, and the committee and the head of medicine there said we couldn't stop doing conventional therapy, which is what we wanted to do, to see what was happening to the physiology, because everybody was loading up these patients with fluid. When their blood pressures would drop with myocardial infarction, they would give them fluid, and of course all they did was go into pulmonary edema and get worse. And So we wanted to find out what was happening physiologically. It was Dr. Fries's hypothesis that it would be better to reduce the resistance peripherally than to raise it, which you were doing when you infused albumin or plasma or blood into these people. And a lot of them were getting transfused. Can you imagine the worst thing for them at that time? That was the conventional therapy cardiologists were using for shock and myocardial infarction, was to give them blood. So we had, I remember vividly, one man who was clutching his chest and screaming in pain, and I opened the femoral artery, and we took out quite a bit of blood to do this cardiac output dye curve with TAT24. And so as the blood was draining out of me, he suddenly sat up, he says, "Now you guys got the treatment, the pain went away." Completely. His angina stopped and so forth. So it was obvious that Ed Fries was correct, and we did some very fine studies and published them in the JCI. I said it was 19 to 20 years before anybody in cardiology thought enough of this idea to corroborate it. And finally, of course, now they all use blocking agents and ways to reduce peripheral resistance, but it was an unheard of concept at that point in time. So Colonel Stone commissioned me, and I went out on the faculty of Walter Reed Army Graduate School. One of the first people, what they did is they used the young officers as assistant teachers for the faculty, and they had excellent visiting faculty. I remember the first one that I was assigned to was DeWitt Stetton from Harvard, and he was a very brilliant biochemist. And so we had a very good educational experience and a very good research experience. And I was doing all sorts of studies on arteriovenous fistulas there. Frank Epstein and I did a whole series of papers on the physiology of arteriovenous fistulas, including the fistula and getting natriuresis from salt water and so forth. And I did a bunch of studies on what happens when you open and close the fistula and stand up. And we had made this into a center, and we were collecting all the arteriovenous fistulas from around the world for the Army, so we had a very large series. And I won a prize, a Davidson Award, for writing a review article on the physiology of arteriovenous fistulas at that time. And then he suddenly decided that the first 6 months of the war, there were too many deaths on the battlefield that were unexplained by the surgeons, and so he set up the first field research team. And it was my understanding at the time that they never actually had a formal field research team working directly out of the Surgeon General's office. They used to attach themselves to, they had research people in the field, but they would attach themselves to the local unit. And this was the first time that it was working directly out of the Surgeon General's office, which proved to be a great boon because they were so short of doctors in places out there. One general called me in the Second Army. He says, "Just give me 2 good reasons why I shouldn't rip you out of this research job and put you to work on casualties." And I said, "General," I said, I don't have to answer that. It's the Surgeon General has to answer that. He's my commanding officer." And but I said, "I'll do everything. I'll work at night and all off time and help as much as I can." But I said, "Unfortunately, only he can change my orders. I can't respond to you. Threats or requests or whatever." So we did this, and we actually did a lot of work. And one of the first things that I did in Busan, and I've written a paper about this recently, is I came down with a train full of wounded to go to the hospital ship. Hope and Repose were in Busan Harbor. And I spent 4 days on the troop train, and I was really beaten up. And the commanding officer of the hospital ship was a man I knew from the Naval Hospital here, and later became the head of surgery up there, and very nice person. And I called him up, and he said, "Oh, I know what you need." So he sent a boat in for me, and came out and let me take a shower in his room, because we hadn't had a lick of water for about 4 days, 5 days, and it was dusty and dirty and so forth. And then he gave me a lovely steak dinner on a Saturday night, and I went back in and made rounds in the hospital the next morning. The first case they showed me was a boy with conjunctival hemorrhages. I'd never seen anything quite like that. And the only thing I could think of is he came from a malarial region. I said, well, maybe he's got a quinine hypersensitivity, because I had seen one case like that in my lifetime who got conjunctival hemorrhages. And then we went along the ward, and about 4 or 5 patients later, another young man with conjunctival hemorrhages. And I said, where have you been? And he was in the same region up north near the Han River. And so then we had another patient came in, and they started showing up all over the place. And the very next day, Colonel Hollinghorst came in, flew in from Tokyo. He said, we just translated a Japanese paper and found out that when they occupied Korea along the marshy areas, they ran into a very strange disease in which the patients got renal failure and hematuria, albuminuria, and sometimes conjunctival hemorrhages. And so it turned out that I had seen the first 2 cases of the renal syndrome of Hanta virus. Of course, it wasn't known to be a virus disease at that time. The Japanese had a different name for it. So we got that study set up, and it went on into turn out to be one of the definitive clinical studies on this disease. But it was years before Dr. Lee and a virologist from the Midwest, whose name I can't think of at the moment, but they worked and recovered the hantavirus. Of course, as you know, it's still here, and so I recently wrote an article called "Hanta is Coming," and we had one possible mild case in a laboratory worker from Fort Detrick when they were doing bacteriologic warfare research at Fort Detrick. Although he recovered, he just had urinary findings and never lost function. But I saw cases in Belgium, and I saw them in Greece and other places, and of course it's throughout the world. It's the rodent disease and the so-called Diablo Canyon epidemic that we had in the Indian population a couple of years ago is the same disease, basically. So that was a very interesting experience, and found a very substantial percentage of them with tubular necrosis, and even documented some deaths inside 14, 15 hours from the time of being wounded. And the surgeons had no explanation of why these people were dead. So we decided it might be acute tubular necrosis in the early stages, and that they were dying of hyperkalemia. So we wrote our report, came back, and recommended that certain studies be done, and recommended that a renal lab be set up over there with a freezing point osmometer and a flame pottometer to measure potassium. And then we did something interesting. We found also that when these people got into treatment in some of the out-of-the-way places, more battalion aid stations or collecting stations further out, where very few people know that the first time human blood transfusions were given in wartime was in the Korean War. You could win a trivial quiz with that. I've asked students that every year, and some of them said Civil War, because technically we could give a transfusion in the Civil War, but we didn't do it. And we didn't do it for one ridiculous reason: there were no refrigerators to keep the blood in a battalion aid station or a collecting station. So it wasn't until the helicopter came in with the Aerovac that they could fly a case of blood and dry ice up to the battalion aid station in the morning, handle the wounded, and then fly back to the evac hospital or the MASH hospital in the evening with what was left of the blood and put it back in the refrigerator. Well, we found out that some of these patients were getting very sick and collapsing soon after they got a blood transfusion. So then we did studies and found out that when you stored blood, and it was not real cold, the serum gained potassium at a rate of approximately 1 milliequivalent per liter per day, which meant that when you were getting blood out 20 days old or 25 days old, that you could have a serum potassium of 15, 20, 25. And if a person was already hyperkalemic and you put that in them, why, you often got cardiac arrest. And so we decided on a cute little trick, and that was to take the blood and spin it in a bottle centrifuge, remove the serum while it was cold, and take the potassium off and turn the red cells into potassium sponges, and then resuspend them in physiologic albumin, put them into the patient, and then the red cells, instead of giving the patient additional potassium, who was already hyperkalemic, we used the red cells as potassium sponges to take it in as they warmed up and they got the glucose in the bloodstream. It worked quite well, actually.
So some of the major advances there were because of your reports leading to the initiative to have battle site field lab units.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yes. That lowered the death rate from acute tuberous necrosis by almost 50%. And we also advised to send out a kidney, an artificial kidney. And an artificial kidney, except for Boston and Washington at Georgetown, which got the first 2 Kolff kidneys, and of course Mount Sinai had one. It was really not very well received in the academic community, and Kolff wasn't able to make a lot of progress, even though he tried very hard. I went around and gave lectures and demonstrations and everything, tried it, but he really was pretty well brushed off, I would say, by most of the academicians in America at that early time. So when the dialyzer got over to Korea and grafted on top of the renal lab tent that they had in the evacuation hospital, and also they set one up in MASH hospital. Colonel Stone had mentioned to me the possibility of going back to Korea. I had 3 little children at that time, under 3, and so he gave me the choice of staying at Walter Reed, which I did, and we had a series of studies measuring body fluid spaces in these trauma cases and in arteriovenous fistulas and other vascular injuries. And Paul Teschan set up the kidney, and we have in our ICN archives some of the original movies of setting that unit up in Korea under very difficult conditions. And Paul really did a beautiful job, and he used an airplane gas tank as the tank for the rotating drum and so forth. And that the Surgeon General sent the kidney that was at Walter Reed out there immediately, and then they ordered additional kidneys. And it was the reception that got in wartime, which gained so much favorable publicity, that really broke through the resistance and made dialysis much more acceptable to a larger number of hospitals. I mean, I think the military experience played a very crucial role. It might have died if it weren't for that.
You'd already seen an artificial kidney while you were still in medical school.
Yes, that was the Murray kidney. It was made in Toronto. It bore a superficial resemblance to the all-wall kidney, although everyone that I have talked to, it's an interesting thing to pursue, but everyone that I've talked to seems to feel that there was no communication between all-wall and Murray. We have established that Murray paid $8,000, which was a lot of money in those days, out of his own pocket to research this kidney in his own home, and he had a lab set up in the basement, and he built it. He certainly used his team, and there are pictures in the Toronto Western Hospital of using this. He was a very innovative, controversial figure. He also was the first person to replace aortic valves with animal valves. And he did some very innovative cardiac surgery, also open heart surgery. So he's quite a fellow, and he got interested in this. But the kidney I saw was brought to Mount Sinai in Baltimore, and that had to be before I graduated on March 17th, St. Patrick's Day, in 1946. So it had to be before March 46. I remember very vividly driving over to Baltimore. There was a urologist at the Mount Sinai Hospital there who had devised an operation for the treatment of polycystic disease, and it was thought to be effective. And what he did was he did 5, 6, 7 hours of surgery on roofing all the large cysts and causing them to sclerose. And of course, some of the patients then had acute renal failure after the surgery because it was a bloody and long procedure. And so he wanted some way to tide the patients over and let them recover. And he thought they could recover kidney function if you decrease the pressure from the cysts on the remaining parts of the kidney tissue. And it turned out ultimately not to be a fruitful approach, but he did have some patients that were just right, just on the borderline, the right kind of cysts and the right degree of kidney function, in which he got very good results. That was rather striking. So I wanted to see this. Now, I went over, it was not in operation, but I saw it in a laboratory in the basement and went over the machine and talked to him about it and so forth. So all I remember, I know that it had to be sometime between Christmas and the time I graduated, which was March. I suspect it was probably around February or March 1946. It's kind of crucial because that's just about the time that Kolff was doing his first work on the artificial kidney. And Allwall claims in his book, doesn't claim priority before 1947. So I think it's quite possible that Murray actually did devise this independently, and maybe out of some prior things that influenced them both. But it was a lot like the Allwall kidney in that it has a container, fixed volume, and you could produce ultrafiltration either by increasing the pressure on the blood side or by decreasing the pressure on the fluid side. Because whereas the Kolff rotating drum, of course, the loops were hanging loose in the fluid and so forth. You could only put in enough. Couldn't put enough pressure to ultrafiltrate because it would break the tubing, and you had no way of putting negative pressure really on that. So it would collapse the tubing. So.
And you also had very early exposure to another type of artificial kidney. Dr. Keel's
yes.
experience
Yes.
was one that you were interested in.
Yes, the first flat kidney in America was Skeggs and Leonard, which is very interesting. And they were, I knew Skeggs sort of peripherally, but Jack Leonard's was a very good friend of mine. He was one of the founders of the Artificial Organ Society. We had a very small group of people, and he was very, very regular attendant at the early meetings. The Artificial Organ Society had its first meeting in June, on June 5th, 1955, and I remember that very well because my youngest son, Peter, is one of the few birthdays I can remember because there are only, as you know, 12 or 13 in a century in a millennium that have the same numbers. So he was born on May 5th, 1955, which is 5/5/55. And of course, then there's not until 6/6/66, so it's a long time in between getting those kind of numbers. So I can always remember his birthday very easily, 5/5/55. Anyway, I went to Atlantic City when he was only a month old, and my wife Joanne was not too happy about that because she was struggling pretty hard at that point with all these children, and Peter was just coming home from the hospital and just getting started. But anyway, I felt it was very important because this was the pioneer meeting. And there was a paper that never appeared in the first issue of the Transaction that is an interesting story. And it was given by a man from upper New York State, and it was about an artificial uterus. And he presented this saying that you could remove people who had premature delivery or premature labor. You could remove the fetus, put the placenta in one chamber, and nutrify it and cleanse it with this miniature artificial kidney, and put the baby in a fluid solution in the other chamber, and you could raise them to term artificially. And he gave the paper, it was entitled Artificial Uterus. And I came home from the meeting and jokingly said, well, guess what, Joanne? Science is marching on. We can now have 3 babies a year instead of just 1. She started to pick up a piece of frozen vegetable package and throw it at me. But anyway, we had a lot of fun with that one. And the man, at the end of his talk, I happened to be in the back of the hotel, on the boardwalk, and he walked back. He was an obstetrician. He walked back and never turned in his paper, and stopped at the bar, belted down a shot, walked out onto the boardwalk, and nobody ever saw him again. After he presented his paper on the artificial uterus, nobody knows who he is or where.
You may have gotten hit with a frozen pack of something hard.
So that was our first meeting in Atlantic City, which was a very rich meeting. You know, the artificial heart was first presented there as well, and the pump oxidator with primitive and many of Kolf's early things were presented there. So it was a terrific meeting, and the first volume of Transactions was actually put out on mimeograph paper by Peter Salisbury's wife, and I helped her do the editing, and then the following 2 years later I became the editor and remained that for 29 years.
And you took a very important role as the editor, deciding to publish some work that was not presented at a later meeting.
Right. Scribner had started his first chronic patient with the Teflon shunt in 1961, and but couldn't get it ready in time. He didn't have enough information to get it to the program committee, so it never got onto the program. But he brought the shunt along, and they demonstrated how to make them up in his room, and he had Quentin and the people up there, and he demonstrated it in his hotel room. And then he said, you know, it's a shame that we're going to have to wait a year for this. And I said, well, if you can get me because we were on a 60-day publication schedule at that time. I said, if you can get it to me in a week, Scrib, I'll exercise my editorial privileges and publish it, even though I wasn't supposed to publish anything that wasn't actually presented on the program. But it was so important that I thought not to wait a year would be kind of silly to the conventional way of doing it. So he did, and I did, and it's in the 1961 Transactions, even though it was never on. So we broke the rules, but it paid off.
Let's take a short break.
Yeah, I guess, how much is there in between this point and the first meeting of the ISM?
Wrote our report, which was then classified, and in the Imperial Hotel, we wrote it in Tokyo.
Who were the members of your team?
Dr. Simeone, who was a colonel then, who was a surgeon. He was a Churchill professor of surgery, and he was the vascular surgeon in the 2nd AUX surgical team out of Boston in the latter part of the Italian campaign in World War II. And he was in the Army Reserve, and he returned to active duty for this mission. He was our senior officer. And then there was a Major Curtis Arts, who was the first person to do skin grafting between identical twins. He later became chairman of the Department of Surgery, I believe it was Mississippi University, and a very, very innovative person. And Captain Russell Nelson, who had finished the surgical residency at the University of Minnesota in the Mayo Clinic, and was a vascular surgeon, and I was the only internist. Dr. Nelson became the head of vascular surgery at the Latter-day Saints Hospital in Utah, and then eventually became one of the 12 apostles of the Mormon Church, and he's still doing that now and has stopped his medical career, and he's full-time with the Mormon Church, and I understand a potential candidate for presidency of the church. He's a very, very dedicated person.
So you were an internist then?
I was the only internist, yeah.
There were not nephrologists yet, were there?
No. And I considered myself, and it is so interesting, actually, that you should ask that question, because I was writing letters to Dr. Goldring and visited him once or twice in New York. And when he heard that I was going to stay in Washington, I had a chance to go back to NYU on the faculty, but I wanted to stay in Washington. And Dr. Kyle and Jeggers were beefing up the full-time faculty at Georgetown. And Kyle taught at the, he taught a regular course in metabolism, endocrinology, and calcium and phosphorus metabolism at the Walter Reed endocrine unit, which was quite good, both the unit and the lecture. So I got to know him better. He had also been at the Boston City Hospital. As a matter of fact, his wife had worked with me as a nurse on the South Department during the diphtheria epidemic, at the beginning of it. And so he and Dr. Jeggers were very anxious to get a Georgetown graduate in the department. They had imported most of the people from Boston. Brock Harvey was from the Peter Ben Brigham, Harvard. Charlie Rath was from the head of hematology was from Harvard and the Peter Ben Brigham. John Currier was from Boston University, and all of the division chiefs that he brought in, practically all of them were from Boston and some from New York. And there was actually no one who was a Georgetown graduate as a head of a division. So they were recruiting me very actively after these sessions at Walter Reed, and then one day in the parking lot, Dr. Kyle put up in the bumper and said, "You owe it to Georgetown to come back here," and so he convinced me that I should come back there and take over the artificial kidney, which was there. It had been run by fellows, and it had only been run, I think, 4 or 5 times in the year before I took it over. And
this time it was clear it was a faculty position,
yes,
right?
Yes. This time it was a faculty position, very clear. And we had a wonderful place because when the Georgetown Hospital was built during the war, at the time the plans were drawn, blueprints, the District of Columbia was segregated and had to have a black and a white obstetrical suite. So the hospital had to go ahead and build on federal Hill-Burton funds, by the way, the way the plans were made. And so they built the full, complete obstetrical units, but they never operated them as segregating units because in the interval between the time the plans were made and the time the hospital was finished, segregation was kaput in the District of Columbia. And while I was a medical student, at first they desegregated the public transportation, and then the restaurants, and then the hotels, and gradually everything. So it was gone. So there was this lovely delivery room with tile floors and spark-proof switches and operating room lights, and it was just perfect for a dialysis place for acute dialysis. So we took that over, and my first fellow was one of Dr. Kyle's metabolic fellows who was intrigued by the kidney and came to help me, and then he switched over and became a nephrology fellow. And
which year was this that you started
this?
This
was in 1952, yeah. And because I had been away from it when I was in Korea, I went up and spent a couple of, I don't remember the exact length of time, but it was 6 weeks, let's say, or something like that, with John Merrill as a refresher. And he was very kind during that time. We were friends already, and I just did it because I wanted to get some quick condensed experience, and so I went up to the Brigham and worked with him for a little while just to get refreshed again, and came back down and took over the kidney then, and we started working on the dialysis of poisons and drugs, and started a long series of firsts. We were the first to dialyze Dorian and the first to dialyze salicylate successfully and the first to dialyze almost every sedative you can name, and methanol, ethanol, and we devised the technique of blocking the metabolism of methanol with more ethanol, and then dialyzing them both out because you could competitively stop the formation of formalin from methyl alcohol and prevent the blindness. It sounds crazy, but you made the patient drunk and stopped them from being blind.
And it's still the state of the art of treatment.
So.
Did you give the alcohol orally or IV?
IV, yeah.
The patient may prefer it orally.
And we had to get it in fast as we were putting him on dialysis. In fact, sometimes we continued giving it during dialysis because it was important to keep the competitive inhibition fairly equal. You know. And Julian Marcarillo from Montreal, who's now the head of nephrology at Hotel Dieu Hospital in Montreal, worked with me on that paper. It was published in the JCI. And we did a whole series of poisons. We also we did the first human being putting human blood over resin, over synthetic resin, and I didn't even know that we were the first for years and years and years. Because I always thought that Dr. Yatsidis in Greece was the first person to use hemoperfusion with sorbents, and he was with charcoal, but he didn't use resins for many, many years. And we had a pharmacologist working with me, Art Pallotta, and he helped us make lactate-loaded anion exchange resin, and we put it in one of those glands that you saw in your silent film in the archives, where that was used for where you saw the blood pumping through the gland. We used one of those and filled it with this lactate-loaded resin, and then brought the blood from the patient up through it, and we were able to remove. We actually did a human experiment with permission, with voluntary permission of the patient and the ethics committee. We gave relatively small doses of phenobarbital, but we gave enough. It's interesting who we picked for a research subject, because the only people that they would let you do experiments on were people who had fatal diseases. And, you know, the immediate thought comes as a person with metastatic carcinoma, if they volunteer, you can use them as a human research subject, because that's allowable under the ethics code. And guess what we picked at that time as an inevitably fatal disease? Chronic renal failure. There was no treatment for chronic renal failure.
Oh,
and so we gave phenobarbital to a patient and removed the phenobarbital with the resin, and showed at least that it could be done, you know, that it would take it off and act as a sorbent. I didn't know that we were the first. I think we published an abstract in somewhere around 1954, 53 or 54. Years later, I was invited to a hemoperfusion congress in Russia. And I got to Russia, you know, it was just an ordinary invitation. I didn't take it, you know, in any special way. And Joanne, Ms. Schreiner, went with me, and we were enjoying our first trip to Russia. And I got there, and they started to roll out the red carpet, and they put me on Russian national television on an interview, and then Ukrainian national radio. And I said, "What's going on there?" And he said, "Well, you were the first person in the world to put human blood over a resin." And I didn't even know that. I said, "No, Dr. Yatsidis was." They said, "Oh, no, you were 9 years ahead of him."
What a wonderful experience that must have been.
Nobody in Washington, you know, got excited about this at all, and I didn't find out that it was the first time until 9 years later.
And your division also pioneered in dialyzing a child during this exciting time.
We did. I think we did the first child under 1. And Dr. Huffnagel, I could hardly see the artery. How he got a cannula in it to this day, I don't know. But it was a child who had swallowed a large amount of oil of wintergreen, which is a salicylate, and we managed it successfully, although it was a very difficult problem to maintain blood pressure, because we had to use 1/2 of a twin coil kidney, and that was the smallest kidney we could get. They didn't have any of the little ones at that time, so it was very touching. You know. We also had the first boy go all the way through high school on dialysis in the country at the time. We also had the first patient dialyzed more than 6 months on dialysis without having a shunt, and that was just about that time. And then Scribner and Quinton, you know, made their first Teflon shunt, and then chronic dialysis began in serious terms.
With all of the activity from your unit, you became very active with the professional societies for artificial organs, and took on a leadership role there also? Yes,
indeed. I had been very interested. Of course, I was one of the founders of the ASAIO, one of the founding group, and I was also very early a member of the Southern Society for Clinical Investigation, and later became its president. And I also became, I was the chairman of the Eastern Section of the American Federation for Clinical Research, and then spent 13 years on the council of that, and became their secretary, and ultimately the president of the American Federation for Clinical Research, which is at that time was the largest. I think it had 10,000 members of young researchers. But we didn't have an American Society of Nephrology then, so the ISN started with a meeting between Amberger and Merrill. Merrill had taken a sabbatical, and he got interested in transplantation. He went to England to study, and I always envied him because in the 40 years I was at Georgetown, I should have had as 5 sabbaticals, and then never was able to take one because the clinical loads were so heavy. And for the first 6 or 7 years, I was the only one on the East Coast between New York and Atlanta who could. Hopkins had no dialyzer, so we did everything on the whole East Coast in the middle of the country. I never, first 7 years at Georgetown, the first 2 years I didn't have a technician or a secretary. And for the first 7 years, I never went through a Christmas time, as the kids know, without having to do an emergency dialysis, either Christmas or New Year's, one or the other, every single year for 7 years. And it was a very, very heavy load. And we also had a Monday night hypertension clinic that we ran for 7 years, one night a week. I used to put a sign up saying 1 night a week for 7 years is 7 years of nights. And I mean, it's a year of nights. And anyway, I got an assistant by that time and turned over the night clinic to Dr. Marr, who ran it. But it was a very, very long period of being alone, and we were, just wasn't anybody else around to do this kind of work, and this was a very busy place with a lot of medical institutions, and I did all the biopsies for the NIH, for example. There's nobody there that could do a renal biopsy. And I did, a few at Bethesda Naval Hospital and Walter Reed.
And you've always relied on your very fine sense of touch to do the renal biopsies.
Klaus Brun came over and stayed in this very house where you are as a house guest on his second tour. I think it was his second tour in the United States. He came first right after he did the studies on acute renal failure. And he came to Washington and gave a demonstration at George Washington, and Al Parrish, who was a good friend of mine. We were equivalent classmates, and actually I used to date his best friend's sister, so I knew him as a medical student, even though he was at GW and I was at Georgetown. We met some of the same people and socially, and so I knew him quite well. He was a very bright fellow. And but he was locally trained. He never had left Washington. But he saw the potential for the renal biopsy right away and took it up and instituted at the VA hospital. And of course, when I came here, I saw the results of that. And we then, but they were using the sitting up technique with a Turkel needle. So I thought that we could get a larger biopsy by designing a thin-walled needle, which I did, and what eventually became the McGregor needle was the one that I designed. And then we filled the tips in with metal so that it would clip off the specimen neatly. And we had a very difficult time with the urologists in town because they didn't like the idea of an internist doing renal biopsies, percutaneous renal biopsies. And the professor of urology at Georgetown was very hostile And I was invited to give an early preliminary talk on renal biopsy at the Washington Urologic Society. And this man was the president, and he stood up in his introduction and said, I don't want to introduce tonight's speaker. And I can imagine a young fellow who had just arrived in town, and here it is. He says, I don't want to introduce the next speaker, but I have to because he's on the program, but I think what he's doing is malpractice. And if he does anything to a patient, he's not going to get any help from me. And he just tore into me something vicious because he thought I didn't have surgical training. So I decided that I was going to be very careful when I set up biopsy. So I did all kinds of anatomical measurements, and I went to the autopsy room, and I asked for permission from the pathologist in selected cases to map out the kidney and put a needle in and before he opened the abdomen and see where I was and make sure that I had the anatomical things correct. I tried to do a dog, and I tried to do a monkey, and I did several different things. And then I still didn't want to do my first biopsy because I thought, well, if I had an accident here and this man testified for it, I was dead, as a young person. So this is where some of the great people in medicine show up, when you really need them. And there was a man at Grady Hospital in Atlanta named Arthur Merrill, just an absolute prince of a man. So I was talking to him about my plight, and he says, I think that it's time for you to be a visiting professor in Atlanta. He brought me down to the Grady, and
when was this?
Oh gosh, I'm lost on time, but this was it had to be late 50s, or sometime in the 50s. They had just been doing them for a year or two, and so he invited me to make rounds and so forth, and I got to see, and I worked with them while they did several biopsies, and then he let me do my first biopsy at the Grady Hospital in Atlanta, and it was a very interesting patient who had malignant hypertension and turned out to have cortical necrosis. It was actually one of the first biopsies I ever did on cortical necrosis and started my interest in that disease. And it was uneventful, and then I stayed there and did some more, and so then I came back up, and I figured, well, I was prepared, and we actually did the first 60 biopsies we did. I think we had over 90% good tissue for diagnosis, which was the highest percentage at that time that anybody had published, and so it worked very, very well, and we actually never did have a death due to
Never in all your years of practice.
Not when we had some two small arterial fistulas, which Dr. Hoffman was able to repair without any damage whatsoever in the normal function, and we never really had a death due to renal biopsy, although the national incidence, I think, was 0.01% or something like that in Llewell's book, but anyway. As I say, we had 100% for 15 years at the NIH. We never missed a biopsy for 15 years. Because the conditions, of course, were selected and the patients were ideal and the patient care was very good and all those things that contributed. And so we started doing a lot of renal pathology and got Dr. Antonovich interested in renal biopsy pathology, and then when Dr. Heptonstall came from St. Louis, so I talked to him, and he liked our material, so we set up a monthly renal biopsy conference, and people came from all the institutions around Washington to the biopsy conference that Heppy and Tanya Antonovich conducted, and Jack and I did the clinical presentations, and they did the pathology, and it was a really very, very well attended and very instructive session that went on for years. I think Heppy would acknowledge that a great part of the specimens in his books were actually our cases that were worked up at Georgetown, because they didn't have that much going on at Johns Hopkins at that time.
So
in fact, Hopkins used to send their dialysis patients over to us. and probably the only patients that ever came to Georgetown from Hopkins.
So these were very exciting years,
Yes.
going from dialysis being a heroic, unusual measure to a very busy practice for you, developing renal biopsies, pathology, and
We
you
developed.
then became a nephrologist from
That's
being an
right.
internist.
And so nephrology, then no one knew what to call us. Some people called the services renal electrolyte services, kidney services, medical kidney services, all kinds of names like this. And then the French came along and liked Amberger, I think probably was the most responsible. He liked the Greek term nephrologie, which is the French word is taken from the Greek root nephros, meaning kidney, rather than the Latin root, which the word rien or renal is from, is the Latin base for kidney, Latin name for kidney. So he always liked the Greek language a little more crisp, found it a little more crisp, and they named the specialty nephrology in Europe, but that word was almost unknown in America at that time. So they formed the International Society of Nephrology beginnings at a meeting on the Riviera. I don't know who all was there, except I do know that Richer and Amberger and Merrill were there. Most of the information I got was from Merrill, who relayed it to me and told me about the interest. And so I was invited to the first meeting in Avion, and Ms. Schreiner and I went, and it was a small meeting. I think there was 100 and some odd people, but it was very well done, and got off to a good start. That's where it was, at that meeting, the Riviera, the preliminary meeting, and then they wrote a French constitution, and they also bought a boat, which was a lateen-rigged fishing vessel from the Mediterranean. The lateen rig enabled the fishermen to turn on a dime around a lobster pot and pull them up. And it was the same way of rigging sails that Columbus used on the Nina and the Pinta and the Santa Maria when they discovered America. Those were lateen-rigged sails. They're obsolete, they're not used anymore, but except in a few places, I think, very old towns in the Mediterranean. Anyway, this boat had that, and it was launched at the first meeting in Avion, and then sent
This was
to...
a model of several, 3-4 feet long?
Yes,
Mm-hmm.
yeah. And sent to... the second meeting was in Prague, and Prague meeting was fascinating because it was, of course, behind the Iron Curtain. And John Broad, who had worked with Homer Smith and whom I had met in New York, was the secretary of this, and he became a member of the Communist Party in order to run the convention. He had to, and so we decided to go to Czechoslovakia just for the experience, to see what it was like to be behind the Iron Curtain. And there was a biochemistry congress, and so Joanne and I tried to rent a Skoda car, which was a small Czech car, and I decided that we had a couple of days between the biochemical congress and the nephrology congress, and so we decided when I got there that there were already certain parts of the biochemistry congress that I wanted to go to, so I decided to rent a car. Well, you know, it was unheard of to rent a car in a communist country. And I decided that I just took it on as a challenge and went around to went through the whole bureaucracy. I had to make out 32 application forms, go to 32 different offices to get a rental car. But we got one, and
perseverance is amazing.
drove to Bratislava. And of course, there was no gasoline, and every time you'd pass a gas station, there'd be a line a mile long for gasoline. So it was very tricky to drive in the interior because you had to sort of gauge daytime when you might run out of gas and where you could get a little here and there. So I mean, it was very, very poor gasoline. So the people who did try to drive in with other European cars found that they knocked and the motors would hardly run. It was, octane rating was probably around 60 or something, and so we came back to Prague, and wondering, whether we were going to make it. And we got to Prague, and suddenly all the gasoline in the world was available. All the stations were open. The whole thing had changed from these long lines to complete supply because the nephrologists were coming, and John was a Communist Party member, and he arranged for gasoline for everybody. So there was no problem getting gasoline. And in Prague, it was very interesting to see. And I remember we were invited to this party one night, and there were 5 members of the cabinet there at this table, and Frank Epstein and I were the only Americans, and we were friends of John and John Broad, and there was a man there from Yale who had become a communist and who had gone behind the Iron Curtain and disappeared and came out as a scientist in Czechoslovakia. So a lot of the Yale people knew him, and in the middle of the evening they got the orchestra to play, and they all stood up and sang the Communist Internationale. And there was a huge big beer hall, and I said, Frank, we can't let them get away with that. So we, at the end of the thing, we jumped up on the chairs, grabbed the microphone, and sang "God Bless America" in the hall. And I followed the names of those people, of the 5 cabinet members who were at the table that night. I think 3 of them were killed in office within at least less than 2 years. And the minister of culture was a defrocked priest, and he had a very opulent party, and he appeared in a Roman collar at the head of the stairs with this very, very gorgeous blonde woman on his arm, and greeted everybody as the minister of culture. But it was a very turbulent time in Czechoslovakia. So the ship was sent to Washington, which was going to be the next meeting, and it arrived. I didn't even know it was coming. I received no notification whatsoever, and I got this word that there was something waiting for me in customs in the Georgetown station. I went down there, and it was a wooden box all covered with chains and locks, and inside was this ship completely smashed and flattened down. I didn't know what to do with it. And I talked to Merrill. He said, okay, you got to get it fixed up. So I didn't want to do it, and the society refused to pay for it. And so finally I had a patient who was an admiral. So we had the ship, his hobby was rigging, obsolete riggings of ships, and so he did a beautiful job and restored the whole thing. And we had it here, right behind where this is being filmed now, on the piano. You remember, my son Bill would remember the ship being here for quite a period of time. And then they wanted to ship it to Los Angeles, and we had a tough time getting it shipped there, and they lost it in the receiving room in the Los Angeles Coliseum, where the meeting was held. And so finally it got shipped to Spain, and I understand got wrecked again, and was sent in a flattened condition to Australia, and they restored it in Sydney, and we all saw it in Sydney in beautiful shape. The Australians did a wonderful job of restoring it.
Thank you. We're going to take a short break and stretch, and then Kim, you can ask about the offices and so forth.
Sure, there are several things.